everyone. Thanks for joining us for today's webinar hosted by Better Business Bureau serving the Northwest. Next slide, please. So before we get started, I wanted to introduce myself and ask you all to take a quick poll. My name is Jade Garcia, and I am the Public Relations Coordinator at BBB Northwest. I will also be the moderator for today's webinar, Demystifying Cybersecurity, a simple approach to keeping your business and family safe in the cyber world. For the webinar today, we will have a Q&A section with Dan at the end of his presentation, but also feel free to ask any questions during the webinar. But before we get started, I'd like to get a sense of where everyone is coming from. So please take a moment to answer this quick poll. It asks, how long has your business been running? 1 year or less, 1 to 5 years, or 5 years or older? I'll wait a moment to let everyone answer. Great, so it looks like we have a lot of 5 years or older businesses. I'm glad everyone is here and wanting to learn more about cybersecurity. So with all of that said, I'll let Dan tell you all a little about himself and give you an introduction about the presentation today.
What does it actually cost for a security breach? This is kind of this is based on data that is actually reported regarding breaches. So this doesn't include breaches that were not reported, but there's research done every year. Currently, the average cost of a lost or stolen record, so a record would be any PII, personally identifiable information that is exposed about somebody that shouldn't. So that would be what be considered a record. So like a social security number, a credit card number, anything like that. The average cost for that single record to clean it up, to clean up the data breach is about $141. So when you put it in the respect of Equifax at $143 million, there's going to be a large cost to that breach. I think another thing that's interesting is that the 31% of consumers discontinue the relationship with the vendor immediately after the breach is disclosed. And now this study was taken over a 6-month time span from the day that the breach occurred to about 6 months afterwards, just to kind of try and get a feel. So it's not the long term. It definitely doesn't reflect the long-term value or impact that the breach has on a company. But definitely within that first week or even the first day that the breach is announced, 31% of people actually stop doing business with that vendor. And for public companies, it represented a 5% drop in stock on the day that the breach. And so companies definitely have to try and now make up that ground from a stock perspective. And so I think one of the important things to realize here is that you may get faced with fines or other aspects of a data breach, but it also affects your brand and your reputation, which will affect the business that you're going to be bringing in with your customers. So you may not get necessarily fined as heavily, or it may not cost you as much from a dollars and cents perspective to clean up a breach as someone like an Anthem or a Home Depot, but the effect that it might have on your business could be drastic, and it's not always easy to measure those kinds of things. So that's kind of some background into what happens, some of the impact that a breach may have on an organization. I kind of want to now step into how do these breaches actually occur? What actually happens, and how does an attacker carry out a breach to actually reveal or to expose that many records, or just gain access to an environment? So kind of want to walk through. At the top, you're going to see the anatomy of a cyber attack, what steps an attacker or a hacker will take to try and get into an organization. And then below is kind of the defender steps, what we try to do to prevent these in each phase of the life cycle. So initially, an attacker is going to do some reconnaissance, just like they would if they're looking to break into a bank, a physical location. They're going to try and find out as much information about that facility or organization as possible. And they use what we would call open source intelligence, so freely available, publicly available information out on the web. We live in a society today that exposes a lot of private information out there, whether it's through social media or just posting on websites and blogs and all these kinds of things. So you can find out a lot about a lot of information about an organization without even ever having to talk to somebody at the organization or going to their facility or probing them at all outside of what you can find on the internet. So some typical resources that hackers will use for this are LinkedIn, Facebook, any websites that the organization hosts. They'll look at job requisitions. A lot of times they'll try to see what kind of technology the organization might be using based on their job requisitions. So if you're an Oracle database shop and you have postings for Oracle database administrators or technical people that have experience with Oracle, that gives them clues and hints that we want to try and find out as many vulnerabilities that might exist within an Oracle database as opposed to a Microsoft database or something else. So as a defender, we want to try and identify as much as we can about our organization and try to put policies and procedures in place about what information should and shouldn't be exposed publicly. And that's about all that you can do in this stage from the defense perspective. So once the attacker has identified as much information about the organization that they can, they then try to find a way to exploit an endpoint in the organization. An endpoint could literally be a laptop that your executive assistant or you use on a daily basis. Some of the most common techniques for exploiting an endpoint would be to send them an email, what we would call phishing, which is an email that is targeted towards a person to try and get them to click on a link, visit a malicious website, or open a document that will actually execute code in the background that actually gives the attacker a foothold into the environment or a foothold onto that laptop or that endpoint. And so this is where from a defense perspective, you would want to put in some protection mechanisms like antivirus, some security awareness training, continuing to inform your employees and your family members that not to trust clicking on links, and make sure that you really validate who is sending you emails and who's sending you documents and what you should be opening and what you should just ignore or delete. So those are some practical tips, and we'll get more into that in a minute. But once the attacker has actually exploited the endpoint, so they actually are now in the environment, they have access, but they may not have the level of access that they want. They may have access to an HR representative's computer or an executive assistant's computer, but they don't necessarily have that person, whoever they have control of, they don't necessarily have access to the information that they're looking for. Like if they are looking for a credit card database or a database with social security numbers, the executive assistant or the HR generalist may not have access to that database. So then what the attacker tries to do is they go through this long process of trying to, what we call privilege escalation, so trying to gain administrative privileges to an organization's technical environment. So when you're operating a computer, you have the ability to escalate your privileges to install software or run things as an administrator. And that's what the attacker is going to try and do as well. They're going to try and find ways to escalate that privilege in the environment. Then they're going to find ways to move around in the environment, and that's what we call lateral movement. And so they're basically scoping out the rest of the joint. So they're inside the environment. They're on some computers, and they're able to what we call pivoting or moving around within the environment, trying to identify additional machines, additional vulnerabilities and risks within the environment, seeing if you're storing sensitive information in places that they shouldn't be. And then persistence. That basically means we're in, we want to stay in. We need to find ways that if we get caught, or someone, if this machine gets cleaned and cleaned up, that we have another way back in. So that's kind of like, leaving the back door unlocked so that we always have a way to get back in, unbeknownst to the victim. So they go through this process, and this actually can take quite a while. And so for some of the most advanced attackers, the average time to detect this kind of activity is about 6 months. On average, it takes 6 months for a company to identify this behavior and identify that they've been breached. So when we talk about trying to avoid this kind of activity, really right here, we're in the detect phase. We need to try and identify things that are anomalous or don't seem right in this phase, that we would be able to say, hey, this looks wrong. Let's go and investigate further and see what's going on, and try and determine if it's a security issue, or if it's it's just something that can be explained in a different fashion. So once they've done all of this, then they actually kind of identified their objective. They've met their objective. They are able to grab the social security numbers from your machine or from the database or the credit card numbers. They found it. Now the last step is that they need to actually exfiltrate that data out, or move it out of your environment into their environment, so that they can do whatever they wish with it. So in those two phases, really, we have, from a defense perspective, we have to try and respond as quickly as we can to identify that information has been accessed in an unauthorized fashion, and try to ensure that that data doesn't leave. And if it does leave, then you're in that recovery phase where you've got to go through all the reporting processes and making sure that you've tried to clean up the incident after the fact. So that's genuinely how a breach will occur from an attacker's perspective. So then the next question really is like, well, am I a target? And I'm going to say that everybody is a target. It doesn't matter what industry you're in, or what your background is, or what what your family status may be. Everybody's going to have a target. And the reason I say that is that motivations really have changed for attackers over the last 20 years. It used to be just a kind of a bragging rights kind of a thing, like, look how cool I am, or look how smart I am, I can hack into websites and stuff like that. But now there's a lot of intellectual property. There's a lot of corporate espionage that's taking place. There are nation states that are definitely wanting to promote their companies, and rather than spending the time for research and development, they're going to go steal that information so that they can get companies in their countries up and running faster. Intelligence gathering, I think, is one that gets overlooked a lot, especially those that don't have exposure to a military or an intelligence background. But this is something that we all need to be concerned about, because if we were to look at the Anthem breach, there's definitely data in there that was never exposed publicly. And so the assumption is that that information is being used for intelligence gathering over the long haul. So you may not have access to classified information. You may not have ever been exposed to government contracts or anything like that. But maybe someday your kids will. And if you have medical issues, or your kids have medical issues that you would like to keep private, now people can use that as leverage against you or them once they actually reach the stage where they do have access to government secrets or corporate secrets. So there's definitely a long play here that we're seeing these days regarding intelligence gathering and cybersecurity breaches. And then ransomware is probably the target, is probably the vector that is the most important for small to mid-sized businesses to be aware of. This is where an attacker will use the same techniques to gain access in the attack lifecycle, to gain access to your machine. And from there, they will actually then encrypt the machine so that you can't access the files or anything on it, and you have to pay them money. And so attackers use the same technique as they would in any other attack, but this is what we would call a smash and grab job. And it can be quite lucrative for the attacker because they don't have to do anything further. They don't have to exfiltrate data off of your machine and go sell it on the black market. All they have to do is encrypt your hard drive and then hope that you'll pay. And that is, I think, one that is really important from a small to mid-sized business. Every organization, has the threat of ransomware, but when we're talking about some of the primary ways that you're a target, ransomware really is one from a small to mid-sized businesses that they should be concerned about. And as I mentioned before, the average time for detection in all of these is about 180 days if they're looking for something in your environment quite for a while. So I like to use this analogy as well. Like if I'm a target, how do I make sure that I've done everything I can to prevent from being attacked? And that's when we talk about kind of making sure you're out of that low-hanging fruit category. So a lot of attackers will just be looking for anybody, and that's what I would call a target of opportunity. So if I were to steal a car, if I were just in the business of stealing cars, and I didn't necessarily have a particular car or somebody's car that I wanted to steal, I'd go and see who left their garage door open, see who left their car unlocked, and then go steal those cars. As opposed to the picture on the right, where, well, if I'm really motivated, I got to figure out how to get into that garage. I've got to figure out if there's any car in there worth stealing. And so I really got to be more targeted at that garage that has their garage door closed if I have that motivation. So taking yourself out of the target of opportunity, like the picture on the left, and putting yourself into the target of choice, meaning like the picture on the right, meaning I really have to know that I want to try and get into that garage and go steal that car. The same goes from a technology perspective. What kind of information have you not exposed or have you limited so that you're not putting yourself into that target of opportunity? And what security controls do you put in place, and what behaviors do you put in place to try and ensure that these sweeping attacks that aren't necessarily they're targeted at anybody that will bite, that you're not in that category of victim. So some of those sweeping attacks, like I mentioned before, are ransomware. The purpose is to encrypt files and on your drive for money. It's a quick fix as opposed to having to sell information on the black market. If this happens to you, you basically have two options. You can pay the ransom, and it's going to cost you money, and it may not guarantee that you actually get your files back, and it may not guarantee that this will happen again. This won't happen again, because you're basically trusting the attacker that was dishonest in the first place to clean off your system and give you access back to the files. So the best way to prevent against this, in addition to putting in some of these protection mechanisms early on, is to create consistent backups regularly of your system and make sure that those backups are not connected to a network device that a machine may actually access and encrypt as well, if it were to become compromised with ransomware. And that's really all that you can do. And so from a protection perspective and a prevention perspective, you really need to ensure that you're doing as many backups of your system as you can regularly, and that those are not going to be compromised as well if your machine were to get have ransomware on it. So some of the other vectors that can be a little bit harder to identify is like this example. This actually happened to us last year. We received this email. Fortunately, we do a pretty good job of security awareness training within our organization, and the user that received this, it was pretending to be our CEO. And there's nothing in here that is a link. There's nothing in here that's a document, but it could have exposed all of the W-2 information for our company. And there are some companies that have fallen for this attack. And so this is where security awareness training really becomes important, and trying to train your users that they need to be careful and look at things about an email that maybe don't make sense. For example, admin at mccraw.com is not somebody that would be sending anybody in our organization an email about W-2 information or requesting it or purporting to be our CEO. So these are also vectors that attackers use to gain information that don't actually require any kind of technical footprint into the environment. Additional vectors, like I mentioned before, email, phishing, scams, people pretending to be nonprofit organizations or trying to help you in some fashion, which is actually a scam. Clicking on links and attachments in emails. You may be running vulnerable versions of software that make it easy for you to get attacked. So that's why we encourage frequent patch management. So updating to the latest versions of any software that you have on a regular basis. Social engineering is genuinely trying to take advantage of your emotions to get you to do something, and there's always a sense of urgency around that. So I would say that you should always be on guard if there's anything that has a sense of urgency, like in that last email about do this for me right away, we need them, that you should be very, very cautious. Text messages are also another vector that people may not realize, that when you click on a link from a text message, that can do much the same thing as clicking on a link from your computer. So you need to be very careful about the websites and the links that you're clicking from a text message or another application on your phone as well. And then rooted phones. This used to be a very popular thing, getting administrative access to your phone. And if you do root your phone, you're just opening up yourself up for a lot more vulnerabilities and a lot more attacks. So I always encourage people just to avoid rooting their phones in general. So some key takeaways, and I'll try to kind of speed up so we have a little bit more time for Q&A here. But I always use the adage that the safest pool is one where the lifeguard doesn't have to jump in the pool, that they've done their job as best as they can to prevent an accident from happening. So the drier that the lifeguard is, the safer the pool is as well. And so the same should be said for our organizations and our families. If we put some practical prevention and protection mechanisms in place, maybe we can not have to jump in that pool and deal with any kind of crises around data loss or compromise or something worse. So when you're browsing the internet, always make sure that you're looking for what we would call the green icon in the URL bar. That green icon with the HTTPS associated with it means that you are talking to the server that you intended to be talking to. So in this case, it's sans.org, but it could be Google. Make sure that green icon is there with the green lock, and that means that you are talking to who you think you're talking to. As you can see in the top right, you're not actually at PayPal's website. Anybody can create a web page that looks very, very similar to any other web page. It's a very easy task. And so you really have to make sure that the URL that you're at and visiting is the website that you intend to be at. And that's where that HTTPS and the green icon really come into play and are important because they prove the identity of the server of the website that you're talking to. I would say for any important websites that you're going to visit on a regular basis, like your bank or retirement funds or anything like that, make sure those are bookmarked so you're not consistently clicking on links from emails, because often banks actually won't send you a lot of links in emails anymore. They will just say go to our website and log into your account. And that's to avoid getting in the habit of clicking on links from them that may actually lead you to something else. So make sure that you're bookmarking important websites, especially things related to your financial data and privacy, anything that would contain private information. Because often the page itself can look legitimate, but it's intended to actually steal your username and password. This Outlook web app page is probably known to a lot of us. That's how we would access email for our organization when we're not on site or we're not connected to our email client. But this is also a very easy web page to mimic and to pretend that it's the Outlook web app for your organization. So someone might send you a link and you go visit it, and if you're not paying careful enough attention to the URL that you're visiting, you may actually enter in your credentials, your username and password for your email, which then will get the attacker access to your computer, and then they have a foothold into your environment. So that's a very common, it's a very, very common technique in the world today. When dealing with documents, always be careful about opening attachments, especially if they have what we call macros in place. So I'm not sure if you've ever seen this yellow bar pop up in Word, but this means that the Word document is trying to run code in the background, and so it is a genuine security warning. So just always leave that content disabled. And I would say if there's one takeaway today, is to go look at your Microsoft Office settings and ensure that you have macros either disabled or that it will warn you before it runs those macros, because macros are the best vector for attackers to implant malware, especially ransomware. So if you ever see this yellow button, be very, very careful before you hit enable content. Talk to the person that sent it, make sure that it's supposed to be running a macro. If you don't know who sent it, don't open it. Find ways to validate the document before you ever open it. Continue to limit your information sharing online. A lot of websites will ask you for account verification using security questions like your mother's maiden name, your high school mascot, your favorite vacation place. If that's information that can be found on the internet through your social media or whatnot, then someone can still gain access to your account. When we're talking about the Equifax breach, I think it's important to note that a lot of banks and a lot of people will use the last 4 of your social security number, previous addresses. All this information that now would have been exposed in Equifax data breach is now potentially public. And so I would recommend changing the security questions for some of your more sensitive sites. Even come up with fake answers. So it may be like, what is your dog's name? And you know the answer to that, but it's not actually your dog's name. So just be very, very careful about how you put answers into security questions and what information you're putting out on the internet. And always be careful about thinking before you click on a link. Just take a little bit of extra caution to know, where did this email come from, or how did I get this link, and where am I clicking? Again, on the page on the right, it's another example of a website that is not Apple, and yet someone may not be looking at the URL and go ahead and entering in their Apple ID. And I'm gonna speed up a little bit because I want to make sure I get enough time for questions. But as I mentioned before, always be careful about who you're giving information to online. There's a lot of ways that people can try and tug at your emotions and pretend to be someone they're not. And I will make sure that we have these slides available from a safety tip perspective. But I would say password management is really important. Don't reuse the same password on multiple websites. Use strong passwords, and by strong I mean the longer the better. Even if it's like a combination of 5 or 6 words, like it's almost a sentence that's easily memorable, that is much stronger of a password than an 8-character password that has some complexity, like numbers and special characters. So the longer the better is the general guidance for passwords these days. And use a password manager when possible, so that you don't have to remember 50 website passwords. You just have to remember one to the password manager, and then the password manager will actually fill in those passwords for you. And enable multi-factor authentication wherever possible. And then some exercises that we take in our organization is that we fight while we train, while we fight while we train. So we continue to assess ourselves and try to see what we can identify, and making sure that we're trying to stay on top of some of the more advanced attack techniques. And so it's just something to kind of keep in mind, that as you're taking on a little bit more precaution in your business, what ways could I help our employees identify cybersecurity attacks? And that's through security awareness training, continuing to attend webinars like this, where you're getting more and more information about what's happening in the world from a cybersecurity perspective. But this is kind of the process that, from a defender's perspective, that you scan, you identify, you do those vulnerability assessments, you do those penetration tests, you simulate an attacker to try and see if you're actually able to pick up on what's going on in your environment. You assess yourselves, you fix those, and then you continue the cycle. Like the mantra is definitely that cybersecurity is a marathon, it's not a sprint. There's always going to be things that you're going to have to improve upon. Okay, so getting into the juice before we get to the questions and answers. I think in the next 30 days, you can kind of start developing your own security program and your security plan for what you want to do in your family and in your business. Identify those crown jewels. What would happen if those crown jewels were lost? Implement a strong password policy, like I mentioned before. You start backing up your data regularly if you don't have that. Don't run your system in a privileged or administrative mode. Set up a separate user that is not going to be running as administrator, and you have to elevate your privileges to do something like install software and things like that. Begin asking questions of maybe you have some outsourced technology partners. Begin to ask questions about how they handle security, and start to identify some potential partners that could help you from a security perspective. If there's people that you feel you could bring in and give you a security assessment, or sell you, or not necessarily sell you services, but sell you, tools and techniques that tools and software that can help in some of the prevention, like antivirus and firewalls and things like that. But it's always good to have some partners that are actually looking out for you and not just trying to sell you something. Enable multi-factor authentication wherever possible. In the next 60 days, develop that protection plan around your crown jewels. Start to do some initial vulnerability assessments, maybe even a penetration test. Definitely start conducting security awareness training. So you could even begin to, what we do at Scentsy is we actually purposefully phish our employees, sending them malicious, pretending to be malicious emails to keep them aware that these things are always happening. And if they click on the link or they open the document, then nothing bad actually happens. They just get notified that they clicked on a link that they shouldn't have, and they're gonna have to now watch a minute video about how to protect yourself against phishing. But continuing to educate your employees and your family about security are important and need to be done regularly and routinely. And then in 90 days, start to find some top 5 security controls, and I can provide more information about that if you email me, but do a gap analysis. So where do we sit within these top 5 security controls? If we do these 5 things, what will it, what impact will it have on our risk, and see what it would cost you in time and effort to try and implement some of those. Definitely begin to think about implementing a phishing simulation within your environment, within your organization. I think that genuinely helps a lot, and it's addressing the behavior that people take with regard to security and email. Hire outside help where applicable. Having a partner that has some expertise in cybersecurity can go a long ways. And I would definitely ask that of your, if you are using like an IT vendor or a managed service provider, start to get a gauge for what level of expertise they have in the cybersecurity world, or could they introduce you to people that could help you on the cybersecurity side of the house. And then finally, it wouldn't hurt to start investigating data breach insurance, especially if you are concerned about the fines that you might face if you were to lose sensitive information about your employees or your customers. Data breach insurance is a little bit of a newer field, so premiums can be kind of all over the board, but definitely worth looking into if you feel like your risk profile is fairly high. That can help mitigate some of the risk from the cost perspective. Data breach insurance will not cover certain things, and it certainly is not going to help restore any brand reputation that you'll have out of a data breach, but it can offset some of those costs associated with it. So those are some practical tips. I hope that we'll have a way to get you these slides, but just for fun, I thought this was kind of a fun joke. I'll let you read that, and then we'll jump into Q&A. Okay, and with that, Jade, I'm open for questions.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. So we'd like to open it for questions now. To submit your questions, type your questions in the webinar toolbar. I'll give you all a moment to type them in, and I'll read them out loud to Dan. one attendee, she attended late, so she was wondering what does MFA stand for?
Oh, sure, yeah. So MFA stands for multi-factor authentication, and that basically means that there are 3 different types of authentication: something that you are, something you have, and something you know. And so using 2 of those, or a combination of those 3, is what we would call multi-factor authentication. So the most common form is like an ATM, where you have an ATM card and your PIN. The ATM card is something you have, the PIN is something that you know. A single form of authentication would be just the username and password.
And then another question we have is, can you talk more about rooting your phone? What is that?
Yeah, so rooting your phone, this may not be as popular today as it used to be when smartphones were first coming out. But basically, it was actually installing software on the phone that would give you administrative privileges to the phone. So Apple and Google don't. When you log into your phone, you don't have administrative access to the phone, and so people have found ways to actually gain root access, which is administrative access to the phone. You have to go through several steps in order to do that, and it's becoming a little bit harder these days as well. But it was a very prime vector for attackers. If they identified, and it was really easy to identify that you were running a phone that had been rooted, they would be able to access your phone fairly easily. So I continue to ensure that that people don't root their phones, and I just continue to discourage it anywhere I talk. Let's see, I will advance to the contact slides so you guys can see that as well.
Thanks, Dan. We have one more question. Is there a specific password manager you would recommend?
Yeah, and I don't necessarily want to get in the habit of promoting any specific vendor over anything else, but I use LastPass. I really enjoy. I've used LastPass. I've used 1Password. They seem pretty good as well. I've not used Dashlane, so I can't necessarily speak to what it's like, but those are good. And I would say that my experience with LastPass has been positive. There's always some risk there. You are putting your passwords in their environment, but they've been very good to respond very, very quickly to security issues that have been reported to them. And so they have a very good security program that I've been impressed with. So that's the one that I use. But I think that 1Password and Dashlane should be fine as well. It definitely is better to use a password manager than to not, in my opinion.
Thanks, Dan. We have one more question. What do you mean about not running privileged or administrative mode? It seems like that would be more secure.
Yes. So to run your system, like if your user account has administrative privileges, that can be a risk. So you want to assign your user the least amount of privileges possible. So we always encourage people to create a separate user that is not a privileged user. So it's not an administrator of the system. And then anytime that you need to do an administrative activity like install software, you would be prompted to enter in credentials for the administrative account. So you're not logged in perpetually with that administrative user, but you're running as a least privileged user. And that will prevent some of those things like ransomware or other malware to infect your system.
Great, thanks for answering that. So I'm not seeing any more questions, but if you do have any more questions later on through the webinar, please feel free to contact me or Dan, and we can get those questions answered. And I just want to thank everyone for joining today's webinar again. And thanks, Dan, for speaking with us.
Yes, thank you. I really appreciate everybody's time, and you've got my contact information up here. Don't hesitate to reach out if there's any other questions.
Yes, and I also want to remind everyone that this webinar will be posted on BBB's YouTube page as well as BBB's webinar homepage by next Wednesday if you'd like to rewatch or this information with others. I hope you all have a great day, and please feel free to contact BBB or Dan with any further questions.